Hi, good evening and welcome to Archaeology Hour, a free public monthly webinar created by the Archaeological Institute of America. My name is Vanessa Rousseau, and I am president of the Minneapolis-St. Paul Society of the AIA, as well as a professor of art history and archaeology at the University of St. Thomas here in St. Paul. Though we are joined tonight by a virtual connection, I would like to take a moment to honor the fact that most of us are on native land. My location in St. Paul is most recently the ancestral homeland of the Dakota people who were forcibly exiled from the land because of settler colonialism, which is ongoing. I'd like to acknowledge our debt, solidarity, and obligation to effect conciliation. Our society is honored to host a talk for this new series, which so aptly reflects the AIA's goal of promoting public understanding of the material record of the human past in order to foster an appreciation of diverse cultures and our shared humanity. As many of you know, this series, along with the many local AIA events, reflects the breadth and depth of the archaeological field, with topics ranging from disease to cultural heritage preservation. The AIA is the only scientific organization whose mission includes bringing free and accessible talks to the general public, and they are now more accessible than ever thanks to our virtual platform here and recordings available on the AIA YouTube channel. Tonight's speaker, Tess Davis, will also be back tomorrow afternoon for an Archaeology Abridged talk entitled The Wild, Wild West, Combating the Black Market in Ancient Asian Art, where she'll talk about tomb raiders and art smugglers that are actively targeting the rich cultural heritage of Asia and selling it on the American art market. The Minneapolis-St. Paul Society's next event is on February 21st, when Dr. Ann Olga Kolaski-Ostro will discuss exploring the technologies and realities of Roman toilets. Not a lot to go on. This event and others will be posted on our local website, aiamn.blogspot.com. But now on to our lecture for the evening. First, a few logistics. The presentation will be approximately 35 minutes so that we have plenty of time for questions, and you may add questions via the Q&A function at any time. Our speaker tonight is Tess Davis, a lawyer and archaeologist by training and executive director of the Antiquities Coalition. Davis oversees the organization's work to fight cultural racketeering worldwide, as well as its award-winning think tank in Washington. She has been a legal consultant for the US and foreign governments and works with both the art world and law enforcement to keep looted antiquities off the market. She writes and speaks widely on these issues, having been published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, Foreign Policy, and top scholarly journals, as well as being featured in documentaries in America and Europe. She is admitted to the New York State Bar, teaches cultural heritage law at Johns Hopkins University, and is a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. In 2015, the royal government of Cambodia knighted Davis for her work to recover the country's plundered treasures, awarding her the rank of Commander in the Royal Order of the Saha Metre. Tonight, Tess will talk about cultural heritage sites under threat and who's driving the destruction, from drug cartels to terrorists lusting after priceless art and antiquities. She'll also discuss how governments, law enforcement, and regular citizens are combating this cultural racketeering crisis. Please join me in welcoming Tess Davis.
Hi, good evening, everyone from New Orleans. It's been a pleasure to watch the comments and seeing how people are tuning in tonight around the world. It really is exciting to see that. And thank you to the Archaeological Institute of America for inviting me to speak today on behalf of the Antiquities Coalition about the illicit trade in art and artifacts. Now, I'm sure you've read adventure novels, paperback novels, seen Hollywood films about tomb raiders and art smugglers. After all, the search for buried treasures is the stuff of legend, but in the real world, the looting, theft, and trafficking of cultural property, it's not being carried out by the likes of Indiana Jones or Lara Croft or Thomas Crown, but by a slew of bad actors ranging from opportunistic criminals at best to war profiteers, mafia syndicates, armed insurgents, and even terrorist organizations. Our chair, Deborah Lair, an AIA General Trustee from 2013 to 2019, joined by Peter Herdrick, who served as an AIA board member and later CEO, created the Antiquities Coalition to fight back against this cultural racketeering. Founded in 2014, our Think and Do Tank, as we like to call it, unites a diverse group of experts where business leaders, former government officials, lawyers, security experts, and other professionals, including archaeologists, committing to ensuring that the past is preserved for the next generation. And in this work, we're proud to partner with some of the local communities most impacted by the illicit trade, with the US government, with foreign governments around the world, groups like the G20 and United Nations agencies, and others who share our mission, including, of course, the AIA. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank the AIA for its continuing work to raise awareness about this issue through initiatives like International Archaeology Day, the Site Preservation Grant Program, Archaeology Magazine, and yes, the lecture program as well. Indeed, it's a personal honor and a pleasure to now be a speaker here, because this is actually where I began my career as an 18-year-old Boston University student working at the AIA's Kenmore Square offices under the wonderful Elizabeth Gilgan. And in addition to directing the lecture program in those years, Liz had conducted some inspiring research on antiquities looting in Central America, which really opened my eyes to the fact that if strong and urgent action weren't taken against looters and traffickers, that soon archaeologists wouldn't have anything left to study. Liz, of course, herself was inspired, as I was and continue to be, by other trailblazers with AIA connections, including Dr. Ricardo Elia, Clemency Coggins of Boston. But such figures, while on the one hand too numerous to name here, on the other hand, were likewise too few and far between back then. Back in 2001, when I started at the AIA, this was not an issue that topped the agenda at archaeological conferences, let alone the G20 or the UN Security Council. It rarely made headlines in archaeological publications, let alone the front pages of newspapers like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. So thank you to the AIA for helping to change that and providing the spotlight that this issue so deserves. Tonight, I'll be speaking about this crime and the threat that it poses to our history and heritage. And I realize I'm speaking to the choir about that. You know a lot of that already. But I'll also be speaking about how it threatens other things. Of course, this is a subject that can and has filled numerous volumes, so this will be the briefest of introductions, one that I hope imparts not so much facts and figures, but why this issue matters. Because if you walk away with one takeaway tonight, I hope that it's this, that cultural racketeering is not just a threat to our past, it truly is a threat to our future, to human rights, to economies, and even to global security. And it's also a threat to the legitimate art market, to good faith collectors, dealers, galleries, and museums, who themselves can also be victims of looters and traffickers. I warn you that this is a dark story at times, but it's one that I hope you do not find hopeless. There are many reasons to be hopeful today. I've been very privileged at the Antiquities Coalition under Deborah's leadership, not only to meet, but to call friends, some true heroes who are making a difference around the world, really combating this issue on the front line, sometimes literally. And this is realizing change, positive change. Many positive things are happening now. Slide, please. Indeed, over the last 20 years, this topic has entered the public consciousness in a way I never thought possible. Last month, you may have seen, millions did on TV and millions more saw it on YouTube, 10 million at the last time I checked. Comedian John Oliver tackled this issue head on in his HBO show Last Week Tonight. The Antiquities Coalition was proud to have consulted, along with many of our partners, on what Oliver himself acknowledged was a larger story than normal. He devoted a full 35 minutes, so the same time I'm doing tonight, actually, nearly the entire episode to cultural racketeering. And in doing so, he takes viewers around the world, introducing some of the more challenging concepts in the field, but in an accessible and, of course, often hilarious way, but often very poignant as well. And if you haven't seen this yet, I encourage you to seek it out, as it will add to my remarks tonight considerably. Slide. Oliver had a lot of material to work with now. There is a seemingly never-ending stream of scandals, criminal investigations, and even prosecutions that are intersecting with the very heights of the art world and making headlines around the world. Just one example, this June, news broke that the Manhattan District Attorney had seized 5 Egyptian treasures worth over $3 million from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, alleging they were evidence of the criminal possession of stolen property and conspiracy. Bad enough in and of itself, but these developments were only the latest in a scandal that has rocked the art world for the past 3 years. For in 2019, the DA's office also had seized a 21-year-old golden Egyptian coffin, which you see here, and which was also from the Met, despite the fact that it had actually been looted during the chaos surrounding the Egyptian Revolution and then laundered onto the American art market by the same criminal network tied to these other recent seizures. This gold coffin, which the museum had bought for nearly $4 million on forged papers, was repatriated in September of 2019. And it was later discovered that none other than Kim Kardashian had a role in its recovery. She had been photographed in a gold gown during the annual Met Gala next to the sarcophagus, an image that went viral around the world. And this in turn eventually led to those with evidence of the coffin's theft to come forward and speak to investigators. Since that time, a number of other prominent art world figures and businesses have been caught up in the same police probe, which now spans multiple countries, including a well-known dealer, an equally well-known gallery, the former head of the Louvre itself, and the Louvre Abu Dhabi. They're in good company or bad company, I suppose, depending on your perspective. But if you name a prominent individual or institution who has bought ancient art in recent years, you'll likely find that they may have had some trouble with their purchases. And this is true both of the major players in the art world, the Sotheby's, the Christie's, the Met's museums, but also of celebrities and business figures. Steve Green of Hobby Lobby, Jim Clark, the founder of Netscape, whom to his credit voluntarily repatriated $30 million worth of Cambodian art. Nick Cage, the actor, and even Kim Kardashian, again, intersects with tonight's lecture. Her interior decorator, unbeknownst to her, purchased a looted Italian antiquity. She too voluntarily returned it after being contacted by law enforcement. I highly doubt that these individuals and institutions are shopping for antiquities on eBay. We're talking about the 1%, in fact, probably the top 1% of the 1%. If they're not the legitimate art market, if they're not the legitimate market, who is? Our colleague, Dr. Neil Brody, himself a past recipient of the AIA's Public Service Award, has frequently mused and wondered whether we can today draw a line between the legal and the black market, or whether there is just a market that seems to be distressingly full of looted and stolen material. It's a question to consider. Slide. That said, in some ways, this is, of course, not a new problem. As long as there have been tombs, there have been tomb raiders, and I'm sure the Egyptologist in the audience today could tell you much better than I about grave robbing in antiquity, and that the classicist here tonight could likewise tell you that an early art law trial, as we think of them today at least, took place in ancient Rome, argued by arguably the most famous lawyer of all time. And in his 70 BC prosecution of the disgraced magistrate Gaius Verres, who had plundered the wealth of occupied Sicily, which he was supposed to be protecting, Cicero argued eloquently that not just ethically, but legally, artistic and sacred treasures should not be privately owned, bought, or sold, let alone stolen. Instead, those who possessed them were only stewards for the local community or even the gods. And it fell to the state, it fell to the law, it fell to the courts to enforce these truths. And these arguments share much, really, with those that you still hear in courtrooms and editorials today. Another example, the British Museum's acquisition of the Elgin or Parthenon marbles, depending on your perspective, was controversial in its own day. This is not a new thing. It was campaigned against and very passionately by perhaps the most famous man alive at the time, Lord Byron. So on the one hand, cultural looting and theft has long been a problem. But despite what you may hear from criminal defendants or art world actors on the hot seat, there's likewise also long been a realization that it's wrong. Yes, ethical codes did not exist centuries ago, but again, if you go back and you read Cicero or Byron, again, the elements that are the soul of them are still there. But it has to be said that due to many factors in the modern world, this destruction is taking place on a scale never before seen in history. Technology has just allowed everything to be magnified. Someone can loot a site in the Middle East, go to a FedEx and find a buyer on Facebook, exchange money online, and have a package to someone in a matter of days and sometimes even hours. This is a far cry from the situation in the past where brick and mortar galleries really were required. So technology, of course, plays a role in this change, but so does demand. Slide. Antiquities now have unprecedented financial value. We see every year new articles coming out recommending them as investments in financial publications. At around $65 billion, the art market is frequently referred to as the largest unregulated market in the world. That high dollar value alone makes it vulnerable and attractive alike to criminals. But in addition to the money, there's other aspects that contribute, including the market's long-standing culture of discretion, some would say secrecy, as well as the unique nature of art itself. After all, two equally qualified experts can look at the same piece and assign a widely different value to it, and that in turn can be widely different from the value that someone would be willing to pay for it. Art is also very portable. Now, one would hope that these aspects of the art market would make it subject to more regulation, not less, but the opposite's happened. I think one reason for that is that art crime has been seen, perhaps often accurately, as the purview of the wealthy. And it's also been seen, and this is very inaccurately, as something that doesn't affect anyone beyond the wealthy. That is, if art crime is viewed as a crime at all, it's a white-collar, victimless crime. So you take all these things together, the money, the lack of transparency, the lack of regulation, the lack of concern, perhaps, and the unique nature of art itself, and you have a perfect storm for a wide range of crimes: fraud, forgery, tax evasion, money laundering, market manipulation, sanctions violations, and terrorist financing, and, of course, looting and trafficking. Slide. So that's the big picture, but I wanted to narrow our lens a bit with a historical case study from the Kingdom of Cambodia. Those of you who know me know that I've had the privilege of working there since 2004. We was there most recently in September when the Antiquities Coalition was honored to partner with the Royal Government of Cambodia and ASEAN on a regional initiative that is launching now. So clearly I have personal reasons for this focus, but I also think that Cambodia's story is important to share because it shows us that the tragedies we're seeing today have happened before, and that history provides us with valuable lessons for what we should do now, as well as a very stark warning for what will happen if we don't act. See, a generation ago, of course, the global hotspot was not Ukraine or Ethiopia or Yemen, it was Indochina, it was Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And in Cambodia, which is celebrated for its 12th century temple of Angkor Wat, frequently referred to as the largest religious building in the world, even today, fighting erupted between government forces and the communist Khmer Rouge in 1970. Decades of civil war, genocide, and foreign occupation would follow, ending only with the 1998 death of Pol Pot and subsequent surrender of his remaining forces. And by that time, a quarter of the population had been lost to starvation, disease, execution, outright murder. Next slide. As happens in so many armed conflicts, the Cambodian Civil War triggered organized looting and trafficking, and in turn, this helped to bankroll further violence. Few of the country's temples were spared, not even the famous Angkor Wat itself, from these war profiteers. And as we're seeing today, this cultural racketeering also went hand in hand with the deliberate and systematic destruction of targeted groups of people and their heritage, a hallmark of genocides throughout the 20th century, which aims to eliminate not only a people, but all evidence of them. And the cost of this were high in Cambodia. 130 Cham mosques, all 73 Catholic churches, and well over 3,000 contemporary pagodas or temples, along with the sacred literature and monks especially too, were targeted by the Khmer Rouge. All of this went hand in hand. And while this organized looting and destruction began 50 years, half a century ago, it's taken decades for Cambodia to rebuild and recover even a small part of what it has lost, but it is doing just that. Next slide. An important chapter in this recovery began a decade ago. So for a moment, I want you to go back in time to February 2012. Few of us knew what ISIS was at this time. Mitt Romney was running for president, and the Giants had just beat the Patriots in the Super Bowl. And on February 29th of that year, the New York Times ran a front page too, ran a small headline that would lead to big litigation. And this was Mythic Warrior is Captive in Global Art Conflict. And in the article, investigative reporters Ralph Blumenthal, who had actually covered the Cambodian War back in the 1970s, and Tom Mashberg exposed that Sotheby's auction house in Manhattan was attempting to sell a 1,000-year-old Cambodian masterpiece, despite evidence that thieves had hacked it off at the ankles and trafficked it overseas as parts. The newspaper illustrated the story with a photograph of the figure in the glossy pages of the sales catalog, and another image, you see both of these here, showed its feet and pedestal half a world away, and at the time still in situ at the 10th century ruins of Kokare and the Cambodian jungle. Next slide. This article led to a slew of others, and my colleagues and I hoped, even expected, that this publicity would help to ensure the warrior's return. Most corporations do not want to be on the front page of major international newspapers for things like this. And journalist Blumenthal and Mashberg had done their homework, an extensive investigation presenting much convincing, albeit then circumstantial, evidence that the statue had been stolen during the early war years. Slide. So this made it a blood antiquity in every sense of the name. And why would any reputable collector want to buy it? And even if one did, why would a reputable auction house want to profit from such a sale? We were wrong. Instead of caving, the auction house doubled down, telling the Times that the warrior could have been removed at any point in its 1,000-year history, and noting that the term stolen was often used loosely. Slide. The US government disagreed with this interpretation, and in April, it filed a civil forfeiture suit seeking to recover and repatriate the statue to Cambodia. We probably have a lot of lawyers on tonight, and we probably have a lot of people who read Latin. This was an in rem action, meaning it was brought against the property itself, which resulted in a rather whimsical case name of US versus 10th century Cambodian sandstone sculpture. All of these cases have wonderful names for this reason, by the way, my favorite being US versus Mongolian dinosaur. But back to this one, bolstered by a series of insider emails, which will make you terrified to put anything in writing ever again. The case file revealed that Sotheby's had been warned that the statue was, quote, definitely stolen from the very scholar hired to authenticate it. And this expert had actually urged the owners to, quote, offer it back to the National Museum as a gesture of goodwill to save yourself some embarrassment. But this wasn't all. Evidence soon came to light and subsequent court filings secured by the Department of Justice that the statue had indeed been looted in the early war years. In 1972, actually, during the country's bloody civil war with the Khmer Rouge and the chaos leading up to the killing fields. And during that time, from Khmer Rouge occupied territory, paramilitary groups had trafficked it to Thailand. And from there, it was smuggled onto Europe, where a premier London auction house sold it to none other than Belgian royalty in 1975, the same year that Phnom Penh and the country fell to the Khmer Rouge, beginning the genocide. Slide. Soon Blumenthal Mashberg and Jason Felch of the LA Times, all of whom I believe have actually been Pulitzer finalists at one point or another, identified another 5 pieces that were looted not just from Cambodia, not just from the same site, but actually from the same small sanctuary, presumably at the same time and by the same people. And not to jump ahead too much in our story, but this presumption too has now been confirmed. Anyway, all were nonetheless on display in prominent American museums, literally from coast to coast, East Coast, West Coast, and in between. Cambodia quickly called for their repatriation as well. And in doing so, it launched an international and ongoing effort to bring home their plundered past. The kingdom had its first success in June of 2013, when the Met Museum, to their credit, to their great credit actually, voluntarily returned 2 statues to Phnom Penh. And according to the Met spokesperson, Cambodia had presented them with, quote, dispositive evidence that the pair were its rightful property. However, even despite this, Sotheby's continued to hold firm to its position, countering in a public statement that the Met's voluntary agreement does not shed any light on the key issues in our case, and we expect to prevail on each. Slide. Yet, months later, in December 2013, with the case against it heating up in U.S. District Court and full discovery finally on the horizon, Sotheby's settled. And the settlement stated that the auction house had a good faith disagreement regarding who owned the warrior, but further litigation would be burdensome. And so it had voluntarily, after 2 years of litigation, determined to return it to Cambodia. This happened in June of 2014, and across the world in Phnom Penh, Cambodia provided it with a hero's welcome, and it was joined by 2 other of these other sought statues that I mentioned, one returned from Christie's auction house and the other from the Northern Simon Museum. And these sculptures themselves, believed by many to be among the finest works in the Khmer canon, are now a centerpiece at Phnom Penh's wonderful National Museum, which I certainly encourage you to visit if you ever do get the opportunity to go to Cambodia. Slide. But this is the end of just one chapter in Cambodia's story. The story itself has certainly continued. In the years since, thanks to the work of many, many, many around the world, we've learned a great deal more about the transnational criminal network that looted these pieces from the killing fields and laundered them onto the heights of the art market. This is hard-won knowledge. It comes thanks to tireless work of many. This includes law enforcement, especially the Manhattan DA's Office Homeland Security Investigations and the Southern District of New York, part of the larger Department of Justice, but also countless academics, journalists, and other advocates. And most importantly, an amazing team in Cambodia composed both of government officials and private citizens working with international partners like American attorney Brad Gordon, who are conducting painstaking research to put together piece by piece the full puzzle of what happened to Cambodia's ancient sites during its decades of conflict and genocide. And they have been joined by Perhaps unlikely allies, former looters who want their legacy to be one of recovery and not destruction. And these individuals who are working closely with Mr. Gordon and the Cambodian government team have come forward at great personal risk to right these past wrongs and have made a critical contribution to our understanding of what happened. And that understanding is critical not only for combating the illicit trade today, but also, of course, for recovering these pieces that were trafficked onto the market. A slide. All of this work by so many people is confirming what was long suspected, that, in fact, a single man, Englishman Douglas Latchford, was a one-man supply and demand of much Cambodian loot before, during, and after the war. We're learning more about Latchford every year, and his crimes warrant their own lecture, so this will just be brief. But he was a British expat born in the British Raj who went to Southeast Asia in the 1950s to seek his fortune and was drawn to Cambodia and its ancient past. And at some point in time, statues started to disappear right behind him. Had it not been for had the story stopped there, Latchford may have been remembered as a colonial rogue, following the playbook of a bygone era. But of course, everything changed in 1970 with the Civil War. Again, during these decades of conflict, the Khmer Rouge murdered 2 million people, violence funded in part by crime, including illicit trade in timber, gemstones, and eventually antiquities. And in Douglas Latchford, they found a knowing buyer, some would say a partner. Latchford, though, took great pains to paint himself as a rescuer of the kingdom's heritage, giving his good and bad faith purchasers alike plausible deniability, and laundered his stolen goods through self-published tomes, one of which you see here, disguising their illegal origins with false backstories and even physically modifying works so they cannot be traced. He died under a felony indictment fighting extradition to the United States, but since the truth is now out, Cambodia has been able to recover his personal collection and is working to recover other pieces he sold to individuals and institutions around the world. And again, this success would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. We're talking about what is arguably the largest recovery of stolen art since the Second World War. Slide. However, while Cambodia's story is one of inspiration and hope, its tragedy is also being repeated the world over. Iraq and Syria under the so-called Islamic State, known as Daesh in Arabic, is a painful example. As Cambodia was discovering its warrior on the auction block and going up against Sotheby's and fighting to secure its return, and then launching this hugely now very successful campaign, as all of these things that I'm talking about now were happening, of course, Daesh was in many ways repeating the Khmer Rouge playbook. This includes organized industrial looting. You see pictures here of looting in Cambodia. Admittedly, this picture is post-conflict, but it gives you an idea of the scale. And then also a picture from April 22 from Daesh occupied territory. Slide. But the similarities don't end there. The Khmer Rouge and Daesh also misused heritage for propaganda purposes to gain legitimacy for an illegitimate cause. Slide. And they pursued the intentional destruction of heritage to demonstrate authority and power and to subdue local populations. Slide. And we now have evidence that organized trafficking was practiced at the highest levels of the party. On the right, the Cambodian pieces you see were seized from the compound of Tamak, who was known amongst a regime of murderers as the butcher of the Khmer Rouge, one of the senior figures in the party. Many people believe that he actually murdered Pol Pot and took control in those final months. And when he was eventually captured and brought to the court, dozens and dozens and dozens of antiquities were found in his possession and his compound just miles from the Thai border and a very willing market. Likewise, on the left, you see a picture of an antiquity that went through the hands of Abu Sayyaf, who was known as Daesh's emir of oil and gas. Daesh actually founded a ministry of culture. It had stationery and different departments, including one of extraction. And when US Special Forces raided his compound in Syria, he was killed in the process. They found not only antiquities, but digital photographs of many more antiquities and many, many receipts for substantial sums of money showing a thriving trade. Slide. But most tragically of all, the similarities is that those who are willing to destroy humanity's greatest achievements, once you do that, the next step is to destroy people themselves. We've seen this again, as I mentioned earlier, this is a hallmark of genocide since the word existed. It's integral to it and its definition. And thus Cambodia's story is a warning. Iraq and Syria's story is a warning that the razing of temples, mosques, and churches and museums are followed by the murder of people. Slide. This is unfortunately not just history. You can go and read the nightly news tonight and probably see an example that took place today of heritage being used as a weapon of war. Ukraine, for example. One of the many tragedies taking place in the Ukrainian war is the plunder of the country's rich cultural heritage by invading Russian forces. The Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine reported on May 10th that it was initiating criminal proceedings for Russian war crimes stemming from a major museum heist. Prosecutors followed on June 24th by announcing a seizure of over 6,000 stolen antiquities worth several $1 million from a Russian collaborator. And a leading expert at the Smithsonian Institution has warned that this pillage is a, quote, purposeful Russian move with specific paintings and ornaments targeted and taken out to Russia. While priceless to the Ukrainian people, these treasures also have the potential to be a valuable commodity to the cash-strapped Russian state, and thus they may greatly undermine the US-led sanctions regime. And yet, the United States does not have any import restrictions currently for Ukrainian cultural heritage. Our markets are wide open to it. And messages cross our desk regularly from partners in government, law enforcement, and the museum community that this material is headed here to our market and unsuspecting buyers. And it is worth noting that our art market remains the largest in the world. Slide. Again, the Antiquities Coalition exists to support the communities and even the countries who are seeing their heritage looted, smuggled, and sold to the highest bidder. When we started our work, public policy treated this as a white-collar and victimless crime. As I've mentioned, in many ways it still does. But we are working hard to correct this narrative and to get across the message that art and antiquities have financed some of the last century's worst villains, from the Nazis to the Khmer Rouge, the IRA, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, Daesh. All of these groups have been implicated in either the theft or looting of fine art or antiquities. And again, as I mentioned, there's also evidence that they may be supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Far beyond war zones, criminals are also exploiting the art market's vulnerabilities to commit a wide range of offenses, from fraud to forgery, tax evasion, etc. So our message is, and has always been this is, again, not just a threat to our shared history, but it's a threat to the legitimate art market. It's a threat to human rights, national economies, and global security. And so we're working to meet this threat by building and channeling political will, partnering with the US State Department, with ministries of foreign affairs, and the defense, intelligence, and law enforcement communities. Because this is not a problem that we as archaeologists, and I was at least trained as an archaeologist, though I am a lawyer today, that archaeologists can solve alone. The illicit trade can be described as a failure of governance, law, civil society, markets, but it's not a preservation failure. It can't be solved by better archaeology. It can't be solved by better conservation. It can't be solved by better restoration. We have to strengthen law enforcement, international cooperation, and economic integrity. That said, archaeologists and groups like the AIA are in a unique position to make a difference here, because you are the ones who are seeing evidence of these crimes in real time. You're often the canary in the coal mine, and you are also the ones who can get across and know the true cost of this crime, of what's actually being lost. You're the very people who can get this information to those empowered to act on it and realize real change. So thank you for all that you do on this front. Thank you again for the invitation to speak tonight, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Hi, Tess. Thank you so much for an inspiring talk, and as sad as it is. I want to remind the audience to please put any questions that you have in the Q&A function as opposed to the chat. And we have a few here. We have a couple of questions about the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And I'm wondering if you have any comments about Native American properties or objects that are still being trafficked. How, what do things look like as far as the material closer to home?
Yes, thank you so much for that question. And this is hugely, of course, a hugely important issue. And it's a very difficult one to combat legally. Lawyers actually are in disagreement about whether the export of Native American heritage is prohibited. There have been efforts to make this clear in legislation. That has yet to happen. And so when Native American material is trafficked on the international market, and it's very popular on the global art market, it is very, very difficult for communities, for tribes, and even for the US government acting with the full force of Washington to recover it. I'm thinking of one example from years ago now, where Hopi material ended up at an auction in Paris, and there was a united front. The tribe worked very closely with the federal government, very closely with the embassy, law enforcement. It was really all hands on deck, and through French law, there was just no way to recover it. And in the end, one of the attorneys actually ended up purchasing at least one of the pieces back and returning it, which is not the ideal solution. You shouldn't have to buy back your own property. So this is something that really shows the gaps and the international legal framework that this can happen. And as difficult as it is to bring these legal cases in the United States, our law, I think, is in many ways the most favorable in the world to claimants, which is unfortunate because, again, it's still a very uphill struggle. These are not easy cases to win at any time. So we can feel free to reach out to us, and we can recommend some groups who are focused on this issue if you'd like to learn more. And it's certainly a topic that warrants its own lecture.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to conflate a couple more questions here. We have some questions about the process of legal repatriation, or just, what laws are invoked and what that process looks like. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, as I just mentioned, it's a complicated picture. And it's also worth pointing out that our legal framework in the United States and internationally is very outdated at this point. It predates many of the things that make the art market, that are having the biggest impact on the art market today. It predates the internet. It predates direct shipping, predates social media, just different various technologies that criminals have been able to adapt to, but law enforcement can't, because we're working with laws that are half a century old. In the United States, the majority of cases today are brought under what's called the National Stolen Property Act. This is a law that has nothing to do with cultural heritage. I believe it was actually created during the years of Bonnie and Clyde, when there was a realization that criminals could easily cross borders and we needed a federal theft statute. So this law would apply, if personal property, if my watch were stolen, you could use the same law. It treats cultural property as property. But the way this law has been interpreted by the courts, again, it's quite challenging for countries to bring suits. They have to show, for one, that there's a law on their books claiming the state is the owner of the cultural property in question. By the way, I should mention this is not a law that we ourselves have in the United States. And they have to show that the piece was removed after this law was enacted from the country's current territory. And this was actually shaping up to be a big issue had the Sotheby's case gone to trial, until we learned the date of removal was 1972, which would have met that criteria. But as you can see from even just this brief description, it's a very, very complicated picture. And there's a lot of gaps in the legal framework that still need to be filled.
Great, thank you. We also have quite a few questions about what we can all do to help with this problem. So I'm wondering if you have any suggestions about that. One person has asked for a link to share with political representatives. Where should we begin?
Oh, well, first, I encourage you all to follow us on social media because we do have advocacy opportunities, and I know the AIA does as well. But when those opportunities come up, again, the voice of archaeologists and those interested in archaeology, they really do matter. Whether it's something like pursuing import restrictions for Ukraine, which will hopefully happen at some point, or legislation, like I mentioned, that will hopefully help to stop the illicit export of Native American material. Showing public support for these initiatives is critical. The other thing I think that the public can do is demand accountability from institutions. All of the cases I've discussed tonight, again, we're not talking about ma and pa galleries or back alley shady dealers. If you name a prominent institution in the art world, they've likely been caught up in a scandal investigation or a criminal prosecution. Something's not working if that keeps happening. Either we need different guidelines in place, or the guidelines that exist for these institutions need to be better followed. This isn't working for anyone. It's not working for the communities who are the most victimized by the illicit trade. It's not working for law enforcement. And frankly, the current system isn't working for the legitimate art market either. If you are a collector wanting to do the right thing, you're in a very difficult position. I mentioned Jim Clark, the Netscape founder. He just donated back $30 million worth of material, and he encouraged others to step forward. And he said, I can see why a lot of people wouldn't do that. So we need a better system, and stronger laws and regulation, again, won't just protect our cultural heritage, it'll also protect the Jim Clarks of the world who don't want to be buying this material, but trusted the people from whom they were buying it.
Great, thank you. And a related question that a few people have asked is what if anybody in the audience does have a collection? What if one of us has an object that we're curious about, and we want to make sure we're doing the right thing? Where do we begin?
I wish that were easier than it was. Two, feel free to reach out to our organization and we can help to make connections. I would recommend that people start with the embassy of the country in question. And you'll often find in this case, and this is why I think it's so important to actually listen to claimants, whether they're individuals or whether they're countries, sometimes they want the opportunity. And Cambodia, for example, has built very strong relationships with museums in America. They want their art to be seen. They want it to be appreciated just in a responsible way. And we see other creative arrangements with, museums, for instance, where it's something as simple as putting up a plaque that this was stolen from so-and-so, and these are the circumstances, and educating the public. But if you do have a collection, and this happens, I mean, people do buy pieces and then the next generation is left wondering what to deal with this. Again, I would recommend starting with the embassy. You won't have the language barrier and they're a little easier to reach. And I can tell you that they do appreciate getting these messages, even if they say that, you know, please keep the peace. They're happy to be asked, and it's a valuable thing to do. So thank you if you're considering that.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so let me see. Sorry, we have so many questions, and I'm trying to sort through the ones that are being repeated. But I guess this is sort of a blanket question. Given that almost all national museums possess artifacts from other countries and may have questionable provenance, where does one draw the line about the country of origin? Also, a related question is whether museums typically have insurance to protect them from loss of money due to undiscovered looting.
To answer the second part of the question, I'm not 100% positive, but I believe the only company that offered what was called title insurance, good title insurance for art, has actually stopped doing it because it was a very risky initiative. But I'm not 100% sure on that, but it's not widespread. The second part of the question, where do we draw the line? And this is quite difficult. There's a lot of material that, of course, has been moving around the world since antiquity. That said, I think there is an easy place to start, and that's and by I mean we, I mainly mean our museums and art world, can stop buying these pieces now. Particularly museums, because museums set the standard for the rest of the art world. You're not going to find stronger ethical guidelines at a for-profit business than you're going to find at a museum. And likewise, the public follows the lead of museums. If they see museums purchasing things, they think, oh, this is an okay thing to do. So I think we need to redefine, and this is a conversation that requires many, many parties, whether museums have to own the material they display and whether there is this need to be buying things on the market. The Kim Kardashian gold coffin, as it will always be known, that was a recent acquisition. That was looted in 2014. Recently bought $4 million of money from a not-for-profit institution. That's a lot of money lost because the I's weren't dotted and the T's weren't crossed. The paperwork was forged, and the forgery was discovered, I believe, in quite quickly by analysts with the DA's office. There was a stamp for the Arab Republic of Egypt for a year before the Arab Republic of Egypt existed. So the provenance could have been disproved not with a PhD in Egyptology or art history, but with a Google search, a very quick Google search. So I think we do need to demand higher standards of museums and encourage those who are doing the right things. The MFA Boston, Victoria Reed there, the provenance curator, I think is the gold standard of this, who is going through their collection piece by piece and addressing problems as they come up proactively. And again, to redefine what a museum needs to do. Do they need to be buying things? Can the same purpose be served with loans from countries, with exhibitions? So it's a difficult question to which no one has an answer, but we need to have the conversation, and it's critical that our leading arts institutions do better. This happening once or twice, a mistake, but it's become a pattern.
Wonderful, thank you. I think that's a perfect comprehensive place to end this evening. And I would like to thank our speaker, Tess Davis, for a wonderful, stimulating talk, and thank all of everybody who has joined us this evening. Again, please also stay connected with the AIA. Think about becoming a member if you are not already. And remember that we have more of these wonderful virtual lectures coming up for AIA Archaeology Hour, and they will all be posted on the AIA YouTube channel. And again, tomorrow, if you have not had enough of Tess Davis, we have this great afternoon talk, The Wild Wild East, Combating the Black Market in Ancient Asian Art, tomorrow. And it would be wonderful to see you there. Then our next archaeology hour will be in January with Kara Cooney. And thank you all for coming. Have a wonderful evening.